Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I rise today to decry yet again Putin's horrific actions against Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. As we bear witness to this deadly war and the consequences of this fossil fuel-funded invasion, I stand here again to denounce our own addiction to fossil fuels, along with big oil's relentless attempts to sabotage clean and renewable energy with the support of the Republican Party. We can see in the coverage on television that the corporate profiteering by big oil and the American Petroleum Institute, the American Prevarication Institute, has once again played a part in war and destruction, and all enabled by the GOP's fealty to oil, gas, and the fallacy of American energy independence. It is a tale of Republican hypocrisy, all funded by the fossil fuel industry. It would be absurdly comic if it weren't so horribly tragic. Oil profits are the engine of Russia's economy, and natural gas is the geopolitical weapon it wields to threaten Europe's energy security. Nearly 40% of Russia's entire revenue is derived from oil and gas exports. Russia's tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery are funded by dirty fossil fuels purchased by other countries, including the United States of America. We are part of the funding of Vladimir Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine. We import oil from Russia. That oil goes to Putin and his cronies. We have a moral moment here to provide all possible humanitarian aid to the Ukrainian people. We have a moral moment here to cut off the money pipeline that is funding the missiles and the tanks that are destroying the homes of the Ukrainian people. And we have a moral moment here to reject the bad faith arguments that are using this horrifying invasion to push for more drilling and money to fossil fuel companies, more lands and waters lost to extraction of oil and gas, and more profit for big oil at the expense of American pocketbooks as our consumers are tipped upside down at the gasoline pumps all across our country, shaking money out of those pockets and sending it to big oil and sending it to Russia. During 2021, Russia supplanted Mexico as the second largest exporter of crude oil and petroleum to the United States. On average, we bought more than 600,000 barrels of oil from Russia every single day of 2021. That's more than $17 billion in American money going to Putin and his oil-soaked oligarchs. We need to shut that money pipeline to Putin off before it does any more damage. And that's why I announced my severing Putin's immense gains from oil transfers, or the Spigot Act, this week. This bill would conclusively lift the veil on the Russian fossil fuel industry's corrupt dealings while requiring the United States to eliminate carbon-polluting imports from Russia, moving the United States towards a future that is no longer dependent upon Russian oil, but dependent upon our own renewable resources. Global oil markets will adjust in the short term and long term to our import ban on oil. In the short term, we can actually supplant any supply disruptions with an additional release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. A 10% release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve would backfill all of our Russian imports for 100 days. Or to put it another way, we have a Strategic Petroleum Reserve of 600 million barrels. If we deploy 600,000 barrels a day, we can do it for 1,000 days in a row in order to make sure the Russians understand that we're dead serious about this. Putin's $630 billion central bank reserve that he thinks is going to protect him and his economy, well, that chest is filled with the spoils of oil and natural gas. A lot of it money from American consumers. It's not just the sales to the United States or Europe, but the interconnected, dirty energy markets that feed off this fuel-soaked firestorm. If we want to truly dial up the pressure on Putin and his oligarchs, we need to end our deadly addiction to Russian fossil fuels and help our allies to do the very same thing. If we want to truly say no more to fossil-fueled war, we need to pursue the pathway to peace that is powered by domestic clean energy, international clean energy revolution led by the United States. But instead, what I hear from Republicans and on Fox News and from the American Petroleum Institute is the same classic refrain of drill, baby, drill. Their insidious answer to war, to rising prices, to any crisis that they can use for their own purpose is more drilling and more leases. Well, where has the American Prevarication Institute argument gotten us so far? One, skyrocketing exports, which hike up our prices to American consumers and feeding into the global fossil fuel addiction. Public lands and waters the size of Indiana that are locked down by unused fossil fuel leases which companies squat upon to pad their own asset base and prevent renewable development. Wars and national security threats driven and paid for by big oil's craving for more profits. Climate chaos with more than $700 billion worth of damages caused by extreme weather disasters in the United States over the last 5 years alone. $700 billion worth of damage to us, to the United States, from climate in the last 5 years. In 2015, Congress repealed the crude oil and gas export ban that had been in place for 40 years in our country so that we would keep our oil here. And it was repealed with unanimous support of the Republican Party on the other side of the aisle. And it allowed for the sale of U.S. crude and natural gas on the global markets. I warned at that time it would be a huge mistake for our country to take that action. It was the worst of all worlds. It led to record-breaking amounts of U.S. oil going to foreign nations without benefiting U.S. consumers. Pain at the pump was not eased, and neither was our dangerous dependence on illicit foreign oil. And every time the Republicans called for more leasing, for more pipelines, for deepening our addiction to fossil fuels, they cried crocodile tears. They said, we need to plunder our own lands and waters in order to lower prices for Americans, in order to ensure national independence from foreign oil sources, and then they exported that oil overseas. That was their plan all along. And it wasn't so secret, it was obvious, because that's how the American Petroleum Institute, the American Prevarication Institute, works. But that argument is now leakier than an old oil tanker. And it's been proven again and again. Every bill that came up approving the Keystone XL pipeline, drilling for oil off our coast, selling off our public lands to whatever bidder showed up, I just asked the same thing every single time. In 2011, in 2012, in 2015, every time I asked Republicans if they would agree to ban any exports from these projects and keep Americans from bearing the environmental and health burden from projects that provide no benefit to their own families, to their own states. And every time the Republicans blocked or rejected my amendments, every time, that proved their arguments won't hold water. The big oil-backed push to extract more and more from American lands and waters was never about helping Americans at the pump. It was about pumping up the profits of big oil by getting a higher price out on the international marketplace for American oil, for American national gas. That was their plan. And I'm sick of the hypocrisy. I'm sick of letting the American Petroleum Institute's prevarication triumph over the truth. I'm sick of watching Americans deal with the climate crisis, with dirty air, with dirty water, with high gas prices, just to help the oil companies make a buck by getting the highest price they can on the international market, exporting American oil. Now, the Republicans push to use the crisis in Ukraine to line big oil's pockets isn't about addressing inflation at home. It's about inflating fossil fuel profits for big oil and big gas. In 2021, as gasoline prices increased by over 50%, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, BP, and Total Energies recorded their biggest profits that they had seen in 8 years. In 2015, before the Republicans lifted the export ban, before the American Petroleum Institute got the Congress to vote to lift the ban on the export of American oil, China imported 191,000 barrels of oil from the United States. Now we send 4 times as much oil to China as we did back in the beginning of 2016, after the ban was lifted. Or to put it another way, we now import from Russia 600,000 barrels of oil a day, and we export to China 600,000 barrels of oil a day. What's wrong with that picture? Our natural resources go to China, which they then use to fabricate products, which then they sell back to us, undermining our own industries. And meanwhile, to make up for it, we import 600,000 barrels of oil from Russia and line the pockets of Putin, which allows him to buy the tanks, the planes, the infantry to assault and destroy a democracy in Ukraine. This is a formula for failure of historic magnitude. And it was all so clear in that debate in 2015 when the Republicans led the effort to lift the ban on the export of our oil. It was oh so clear what was going to happen, which is why I led the fight here on the Senate floor to block the lifting of that ban. But I don't want to hear from the Republicans with their crocodile tears how much they care about importation of oil from Russia, because the bottom line is we now import 8.6 million barrels of oil a day into the United States. We now have a crisis on our hands that we have to ultimately deal with. We export 8.6 million barrels of oil a day. We export out of our country 8.6 million barrels of oil a day. So I hear from Republicans, oh, we need energy independence. Well, what are we doing exporting 8.6 million barrels of oil a day? What's that all about? We know what it's all about. It's about the American Petroleum Institute. It's about big oil and big gas getting a higher price on the international market than they get in the domestic market. That's what it was all about from the very beginning. And we have an opportunity here to stop, finally, big oil's relentless quest for profit, which is funding Putin's war. At the same time, it undermines our competitiveness with China. More leases are not going to help our allies in Europe. We're already sending our oil to the highest bidder. Oil and gas companies already have leases the size of Indiana. Let me say that again. The oil and gas industry have bid for, over the last 2 decades, leases to drill on the property owned by the American people, and 53% of those leases have yet to be drilled upon. That is the truth. If they're serious, which they're not, they should start drilling. If their crocodile tears are real, in fact, they should just start drilling. But of course, they're not going to, because they, by squatting on those lands, keep the price of oil high. They keep the price of natural gas high. And Japan and South Korea and China right now get more of our imports than any other country. If oil companies really wanted to help Europe get off Russian gas, they could do that right now with the resources they have. And let me say that again. Oil companies could help Europe get off Russian natural gas right now with the resources they have. But that's not what they want. They want unfettered profit, more public lands, and more power on the global market. And that profit, that oil-soaked power, has directly fueled Putin's war on Ukraine. So there's a different pathway, and we have to commit to destroying demand for Putin's dirty energy business model by powering our country with clean, American-made, renewable energy. And we can power our way to peace. An additional 16 million electric vehicles on the road in the United States would replace all of the oil that we import from Russia on a daily basis. By passing the $555 billion investment in clean energy and climate justice, we can build a made-in-America clean energy economy that delivers real energy independence. We can unlock a safe, healthy future and untether ourselves from Putin's dirty profits. With tax credits and rebates in wind and solar, offshore wind, transmission, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and advanced domestic manufacturing, we can cut costs at home while cutting off Putin's money pipeline. These investments would reduce our dependence on global oil markets and instead power our country through localized clean energy. Our federal climate policies, our federal energy policies are exactly what we need in this moment, this national security, moral, and economic moment. We don't need to power our nation on Russian oil and sell off our forests and seas for an unnecessary big oil land grab when they already have an area the size of Indiana that they're not drilling on, because that increases their profits right now. We don't need to pay for Russia's invasion of Ukraine through Russian imports while paying higher prices at the pump to support profiteering and exports. Let's wake up and win the renewable race to the future. Let's reject fossil fuel greed for what that is, just greed. Let's protect our allies by destroying Putin's business model and delivering a future powered by domestic clean energy. That's the promise of peace. That's the promise to the whole world, to live in this safe planet. This is the promise we must make to the next generation of American young people and young people of the world. that we are going to power a clean energy revolution of wind and solar and all-electric vehicles and battery storage technologies, and we're going to destroy the business model of Russia, destroy the business model of other petro-states around the world with American innovation. That's what the young people of our country and the world should expect from this generation and this Senate in 2022 on the floor of the United States Senate. That's the debate which we should have this year on behalf of a safer, more peaceful, more healthy, and more moral world. Mr. President, I yield back.
Mr. President.
The senator from Iowa.